Okay.
Okay, all right. So let's start with Ruth, chapter 1, verses 15 through 18, and then I'll talk about some context for this. Look, said Naomi, your sister-in-law is going back to her people and to her gods. Go back with her. But Ruth replied, don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if anything but death separates you and me. When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. Now, as we read that scripture, there are a lot of people who go, wait a minute, that sounds like a marriage ceremony. Yes, because this scripture is one of the most used passages in heterosexual marriages. Whither thou goest, I will go, right? It's a beautiful passage. Now, one of the things that we're doing today as we read scripture is queering the scripture, okay? And that does not mean that we are making things queer that aren't, because this passage is already queer, okay? Now, some people have tried to use the argument that in this particular story of Ruth and Naomi, they're talking about a same-sex relationship, and it is that, but is it sexual? I actually would think that it's probably not. Okay? In the story, the backstory is that Ruth and her sister have married these two brothers who are sons of Naomi. And Naomi's husband has died, and the sons have died. So Naomi is left with her two daughters-in-law, Ruth and her sister. And things are hard. Times are hard, and especially for women alone. That just did not happen. You don't survive as a woman on your own, which is why we get continual scripture injunctions to take care of widows and orphans. Okay? So it's come to a point where things are so difficult that Naomi says to the two girls, you know, I'm done for, but you two still have a chance. So go home to your own parents and to your families and to your gods and be well, and I will go off and die in the desert, basically. Right? Sad but true, right? Ruth's sister acknowledges that she can't do this anymore, and she goes home, and there's no shame in that. But Ruth is so devoted to Naomi that she says to her, no, there's not anything in the world you can make me do to leave you. The only thing that's ever going to separate us is death. And so Naomi gives up on trying to convince Ruth to go away, okay? Now, this does not mean it couldn't have been a romantic relationship, because that could have developed as well. The chances, however, I think are not great, just because the scriptural context doesn't give us any hints toward that. But what it does do for us, I think, is to say, you know what? Sometimes you have to consider the possibility. Right? If our reading is so heterosexualized of the scripture that thought never enters our mind, then I think we're missing something. So I think the importance here is that God is giving us all kinds of models for relationships. And sometimes those relationships are sexual and intimate and romantic, and sometimes they're not. But the pictures that we have in the scripture of relationships and family are really broad. So when people talk today about the traditional family, I kind of want to barf, because they have no clue what they're talking about.
Right.
The traditional nuclear family that we talk about is made up, and it's very, very recent. People in the 1900s, in the early 1900s, did not live with mom and dad and 2.6 kids in a tenement working in a factory. They also lived with extended family. All right? There are all kinds of moms and aunts and grandmas running around, okay? So the idea that we lived in these little cocoons is really from the 50s, okay? It's actually post-World War II. That's where we get the traditional family. How traditional can that be? Okay, so to try to impose that view on the scripture is incorrect. So God is giving us all kinds of models of family, all right? Now, there are, however, some more pointed references in the scripture that really do appear to be homoerotic. So let's look at the story of Jonathan and David. Now, a lot of people use the scripture, this great friendship between these two. Yeah, they were friends. The thing is, I think they were probably more than friends too. And a lot of new scholarship is starting to agree with this. Let's start with 1 Samuel 18, 1 through 4. This is when Jonathan and David first meet. And it's kind of interesting when you look at this passage, because if you've ever thought about, is there love at first sight? I think this kind of confirms it for us. After David had finished talking with Saul, and Saul is Jonathan's father, Saul's the first king of Israel, okay? After David had finished talking with Saul, Jonathan became one in spirit with David, and he loved him as himself. From that day Saul kept David with him, and did not let him return to his father's house. And Jonathan made a covenant with David, because he loved him as himself. Jonathan took off the robe he was wearing, and gave it to David, along with his tunic, and even his sword, his bow, and his belt. And then we go on to read about sort of the adventures and the drama between David and Saul. Okay, Saul is king of Israel and is incredibly jealous of David, who is so much more successful than Saul. Now Saul already knows the prophecy that he's not going to be king for long because he's done some stuff he shouldn't have been doing, and not relying on God. And he's had that warning. So he just gets more and more jealous, all right? But one of the other things that Saul is jealous of is the relationship between his son Jonathan and David. Because Saul recognizes that there's a threat here, not only in terms of their intimate relationship, but because of what that means for the kingdom, okay? Because Jonathan is willing to give up his right to the throne to David, all right? So our passage that we read next, and I apologize, there's a misprint in the bulletin, it's actually chapter 20, 1 Samuel chapter 20, verses 30 through 42. Okay, now back and forth, Saul has decided he's going to kill David, so there's some drama going on here, okay? Just so you have that as a backdrop. So beginning with verse 30, Saul's anger flared up at Jonathan, and they're at dinner together, okay? Nice family meal when we argue. Saul's anger flares up at Jonathan, and he said to him, "You son of a perverse and rebellious woman. Don't I know that you've sided with the son of Jesse to your own shame and to the shame of the mother who bore you? As long as the son of Jesse lives on this earth, neither will you nor your kingdom be established. Now send and bring him to me, for he must die." "Why should he be put to death? What has he done?" Jonathan asked his father. But Saul hurled his spear at him to kill him. This is a guy with a short temper. Then Jonathan knew that his father intended to kill David. Jonathan got up from the table in fierce anger. On that second day of the month he did not eat, because he was grieved at his father's shameful treatment of David. In the morning Jonathan went out to the field for his meeting with David. He had a small boy with him, and he said to the boy, "Run and find the arrows I shoot." As the boy ran, he shot an arrow beyond him. When the boy came to the place where Jonathan's arrow had fallen, Jonathan called out for him, "Isn't the arrow beyond you?" And he's sending him on a goose hunt, right? Or a snipe hunt, perhaps. Right? He's trying to get rid of the boy. All right. Then he shouted, "Hurry, go quickly, don't stop." The boy picked up the arrow and returned to the master, because he didn't know what was going on. The boy knew nothing at all of this, only Jonathan and David knew. Then Jonathan gave his weapons to the boy and said, "Go, carry them back to town." After the boy had gone, David got up from the south side of the stone and bowed down before Jonathan 3 times with his face to the ground. Then they kissed each other and wept together, but David wept the most. Jonathan said to David, "Go in peace, for we have sworn friendship to one another in the name of the Lord, saying, 'The Lord is witness between you and me, and between our descendants and my descendants forever.'" Then David left, and Jonathan went back to the town. Now there's a part in this scripture where the Hebrew itself is unclear. And that has to do with the section when they're talking about kissing and weeping together behind the stone. Now here's one of the ways that we can look at the scripture. The reference that Saul makes when he calls his son this derogatory name, right? And dads have been calling their sons names forever. But in this particular context, it has a sexual connotation. Okay? That son of a perverse woman idea, he's actually making a sexual reference. Saul knows what's going on. He knows how intimate this relationship is between Jonathan and David, because it doesn't make any sense to insult somebody in a way that has nothing to do with the context in which you're insulting them, right? Mm-hmm. Okay? So if I want to insult a gay person, right, often that insult will involve what? Effeminacy, some of the stereotypes, right? And when somebody makes an insult like that, don't they know what they're talking about? Right? It wouldn't make any sense if I were to make an insult to a gay man to reference race, or their bad cooking, right? Or their class. No, that insult is going to be sexual. Because that makes sense, it's context. And again, we have this to back us up. The scripture piece in there, the Hebrew that's unclear, Professor Boswell has talked about in his book, and I know there's controversy about that, that's fine. There always is with new scholarship, right? But one of the things that may have been referenced here was a sexual relationship that was going on behind that rock. Okay? If you look at the ritual, where he's kissing the ground 3 times, right? And if you look at that and compare that to that earlier piece in chapter 18, where Jonathan gives him his cloak and his tunic and his belt and all those things, those are very reminiscent of a marriage ceremony. It is very possible that that love at first sight that Jonathan experiences is so great, and apparently it's 2 ways, because David loves Jonathan, and Scripture tells us at Jonathan's death that David weeps and mourns and declares that he loved Jonathan more than he ever loved any woman, right? To not read this as an intimate relationship, I think is far more of a stretch than the reverse. To try to make these guys straight in the way that we want them to be straight, if you're opposed to finding us in the Scripture, I think you have to go through a lot more academic gymnastics to make that happen than to just read it for what it says. Which is, these 2 guys loved each other, right? Now, we talked a little bit last week about how gay identity, right, the idea of homosexual, is actually fairly new. Okay, we would not have identified these as gay people because we didn't exist at that point. But that does not mean that there were not people who were not attracted to same-sex people, okay? Because there's a difference in what you do and the identity that you form as a group, okay? So, there's no reason not to believe that Jonathan and David were in fact just what they appear to be in Scripture. And that is that they were probably lovers. And very, very close lovers. Certainly the early Christians looked at this passage and saw the same thing. Many early Christians held this up as a model of intimate relationship between 2 men. Okay? So, we have to understand that when we come to the Scripture, we all come with biases. Now, there are those who will argue from the other point of view that you should just read what Scripture says, and what it's most plainly saying is what you should accept. Well, if you come with this Scripture without the cultural bias of anti-gay stuff that we're raised with, very clearly on the surface, this looks all like all the world, like 2 guys who are in love. And I think they were. And I think that the Scripture bears that out. Okay? So, we know, and here's the thing, it's not like it's an example of what not to do, because here's David. David is the apple of God's eye. David is one of God's favorite people in all of Scripture. There is no condemnation of this relationship. In fact, it is celebrated throughout Jewish history and early Christian history. It is celebrated as it should be. So we want to turn now to some of the New Testament stories, and we're going to pause just a moment while our tech person here sort of adjusts our filming